You know what? I'm getting kind of tired of these blank walls. I think this calls for a location change to outside. Ah, much better. Gunslinger Girl Season 1. Now, as this title suggests, I'm only going to keep this review constricted to the Season 1 of Gunslinger Girl. I'm not going to focus on the second season. I might do that in a review later on. I just haven't seen it yet or complete it. So in this case, I'm just going to sit here and just talk about Season 1. With that said, let's get into the story. Now, the story of Gunslinger Girl follows the tale of several young women, all of which are employed by what is known as the Social Welfare Agency in Italy, and it allows for young girls who have had a near-death or very traumatic experience with their life, and allows them to be employed and rehabilitated into this agency, but unfortunately it's also a bit of a ruse in which they are also trained as highly efficient cybernetic assassins. Each one of these young women will have what's known as a fratello, which is an Italian word for sibling, and each of these fratellos, or handlers as some people call them, are allowed to handle each of these young women as they see fit, whether it's be through kind or gentle means, or to be very cold, brutal, and efficient. It just depends, and it is up to subject to each handler themselves and their personal preferences and tastes. And each of these fratellos can increase the efficiency and the abilities of all these girls through a process known as conditioning, which increases the amount of brainwashing, amount of implants, but also the big risk in terms of the girls because it also shortens their lifespan through this process. Now, this is a show that my friend Rachel has been requesting me for months. She considers it highly underrated, and so I recently got a copy of it, and we marathoned it through all together with her sitting next to me, and I was able to demonstrate and develop my thoughts as I watched the show. And I must admit, I'm thoroughly impressed by how this show is. It is a really, really interesting show in terms of both how restrained it is and how tragic it is, but also how gorgeous it is. And let me go into depth into why I say these things. Given the fact that the show is set in Italy, you would expect these creators to take advantage of the setting and the locations of which they are given. And, of course, they do. It's actually very, very beautiful, just like the country itself, but at the same time, there's also a sense of kind of gloominess to the whole nature. I mean, a lot of this show is set in back alleys, through actual streets of Italy. It doesn't have that many grandiose shots of the Italian cities themselves, like in Florence, Venice, through Rome, all that stuff. And just seeing these cities, I mean, there are a couple of shots that do emphasize the architecture to set up context in terms of where you are and where you're going, but it never takes time to see the landscapes, but at least it does set up context, and the fact that they do take a more interesting route instead of the back alleys of architecture. I mean, there's even one particular segment where I noticed that they were showing the camera angle of the characters behind them, and it showed that the houses were going in a curved direction. And for those of you who might not be aware, that was actually an intentional architectural illusion to give the idea that the cities were actually bigger than what they were supposed to be. So that, in that aspect, it shows really good attention to detail of the Italian landscape, and I have to commend Gunslinger Girl for doing that. And the music for this show, oh my word, is it beautiful! I mean, the fact that the voice actresses even sang during the course of this show is actually very impressive in itself. The use of violins, pianos, and even grandiose orchestras is just absolutely wonderful to hear. And the fact that it even lends to the atmosphere and the mood of the show itself is also a great compliment to the style of it. One scene in particular which stood out in my mind, and I won't spoil exactly what's going on, in which the young women are all singing Ode to Joy in German. I mean, seriously, that is beautiful. The fact that you went so far as to recite a very classic piece of music in that language during the course of an anime, that's something I've never really seen. And I will admit there are probably other animes that do this similar thing where they sing classical music in different languages. I just haven't seen them, and so I'm taking this just on its face, and I was very, very impressed by the fact that they did this, and did it well. It helped lend to the scene, it helped put a sense of grandiose moodiness to it, but also a sense of kind of tragedy, and I won't, again, spoil what's going on in the scene, but if you know the season, you know what's going on, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm leaning into this. One thing that really impressed me the most is the characters and how much I got involved with each of them. I will admit that some characters get a little bit more emphasis than others, but for the sake of fact of keeping a narrative consistent. but at the same time, there's also not an overarching villain for this show. In fact, the biggest villain is probably the handlers and the girls themselves. And if you watch the show, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this, in the fact of the conditioning process. But again, I'm trying to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. But there's also a case where with each episode, you kind of see a little bit of the character's backstory. For example, you see one girl's episode, you see their backstory through flashbacks. There's another girl, and it's a different episode with each of their own different flashbacks. In fact, there's one backstory in particular that stood out in my mind so much that I'm thinking, that is the most despicable, effed up backstory I have ever heard for a character since the twins in Black Lagoon. I am serious, it is that dark. And it's so, you feel so sorry for these young girls, the fact that they had such traumatic experiences in their life, and you feel sorry for each and every one of them for different reasons. One could be more rebellious than the other, some can be treated fairly well in terms of an actual person, and the other ones are treated like nothing more than objects and things. And that also leads into probably one of the most fascinating aspects of this show, is its science fiction. This is probably the most restrained science fiction show I've ever seen, and that's due in part to the fact that while it is true that these girls are cybernetically enhanced, you rarely ever see any of the gears shifting, the parts moving, and it's so restrained in the fact that it gives a little bit of mystery to the technology and what led society to get to this point. And so, on that level, I kind of respect the fact that it restrains itself in that, but at the same time, it makes you more curious about what is going on in the show, what technology lends it to it. And it's not like these girls are invincible. They can get damaged just as fine if you hit a bullet with them, but there's just so many ways that you could explore this technology, and maybe they explored in Season 2 or in the manga a little bit more. I haven't read it and I haven't seen it, so I will not judge it for that reason. But either way, I was impressed by the fact that it restrained itself in so much sci-fi aspects when you really could have gone into easily cyberpunk territory, similar to that of Ghost in the Shell, Armitage 3, or Marduk Scramble. And the handlers, oh my lord, they infuriated me to no end, except for Jose, because he is probably one of the few handlers that is decent all around. And I won't say why, but every other handler I kinda despise on a very critical, fundamental level, and I can't explain for the sake of the spoiler-free review. But each and every one of them, just to give a broad blanket statement, is very, how do I put this, cold to each and every one of these girls. And it just feels like they treat them like things. But it also raises a kind of an ethical issue in terms of, well, what if these characters, what if these people had these cybernetic implants and they were cyborgs, really? Would you treat them as humans? Would you treat them as us objects? And just see that clash of ideology is something that I personally found interesting, and it seems like, given the time frame and the technology that's around at this point, it seems like it is a fairly new technology by the time that the show begins. Or at least, it's new enough in the sense that it hasn't spread throughout population through mass production. And so, just this idea, this conflict of people's own ideologies and seeing them as either things or people, that idea is very fascinating to me, and one that I'm glad that this show would explore through each handler's different personalities and their preferences throughout the show. So overall, with regards to Gunslinger Girl, I have to admit I was very impressed with it. The Italian setting gave it a much more unique location and distinct feel, and I'm glad that the fact that they took advantage of the architecture, the setting, its back alleys, and attention to detail with regards to the city layouts. The ethical discussions brought up during the course of the show really made me think about this on a much more personal level. Either way, just on a basic level, it's a lot more interesting than I originally thought the show was going to be. Not to mention the characters themselves, each of them given their own unique backstory, and all of them are interesting, and each one of them you feel sorry for. Also, the handlers all have their own different ways of handling each girl, resulting in different scenarios and different conclusions, some of which are much more pleasant than others, and some of them are a lot more tragic, believe me. And finally, the music is just so beautiful. I cannot emphasize this enough. I would probably recommend this show just based on the soundtrack alone. It is absolutely wonderful. So with all that into consideration, I have to say that Gunslinger Girl Season 1 is absolutely worth every penny. So there you go, folks. That is my review of Gunslinger Girl Season 1. I apologize for the hissing in the background. That was just my sprinklers coming on the bottom floor. If you guys heard it or not, I can't tell just from up here. So anyways, tell me what you think of having this outside location. I personally thought it was kind of nice to just have a little bit of a change of pace, not have so many blank walls. I just felt like that was a little bit dull. I mean, I would have preferred to get the beach in location just in camera, but I just couldn't get the lighting to work. Maybe tomorrow, if you want me to do another outside review, or another time when you want me to do this outside location, just let me know. And until next time, I'm Perry the One-Armed Legend. You name it, I can play it.